There, should be good to go. Thanks for the introduction, Jed. Although you are hearing my voice, I also have to, and I want to acknowledge the part that Bill Hutchinson and Eric Berkness have given to this project that Bill spearheads. Both Bill and Eric are from the Department of Entomology at the University of Minnesota. Three topics I'll cover this morning. Two are funded projects from your organization. That's our adult wild test program and also some information on field insecticide plots. And we have data from 2019 and 2020 to give you. Also because it's related to the earworm resistance issue. I would like to talk briefly at the end about the BT sentinel plots that Galen Dively at the University of Maryland has spearheaded. Okay, let's first start out with the adult wild tests. We use them to monitor adult earworm resistance to the synthetic pyrethroids. Two locations each year, one at Rosemont, Minnesota, and one at Arlington, Wisconsin. And for each of those locations, we had two timings, or at least we tried to have two timings per year. One in late August when the moths would start to migrate up and we had enough migration to catch enough males. And then later in September to see if there could be a difference in mortality. As I mentioned, I've got 2019 and 2020 results. Our ultimate goal is to compare the mortality from the AVT test for the adults to the larval mortality from our insecticide trials. A little bit about the methodology. We use cypermethrin as a surrogate for all of the other pyrethroids. The vials were treated by Dr. David Kearns, Texas A&M University. And at the right-hand side of the screen, you can see what the hardware looks like. They're about 1 ounce glass vials. The treatments are coated on the inside of that glass vial. There are one-use only treatments. We trapped male moths from the pheromone traps and we transferred them to these vials early in the morning when they're less active and there's less trauma. And the diagnostic treatments that we used were 5 micrograms and also 10 micrograms of cypermethrin per vial. And we had an untreated check as the positive control. We normally think of insects in our job as being difficult control, and that's why we're here. But when you look at the adults or some other life stages of insects, stress can really increase mortality. And we try to eliminate stress as much as we can in these adult wild tests. And by doing that, we keep the lid open a little bit, quarter turn, so you can get exchange of oxygen. It's kept in a cool area and out of the sun, because it's important as much as we can or as best as we can in the untreated vials to have near 100% survival. At the end of a 24-hour period of time when the adult is in the vial, we then assess whether they are alive, meaning they're capable of normal flight, or if they're dead, meaning they can't fly greater than 3 meters. Let's look at the data. First from Minnesota, 2019. Let me explain the table a little bit. On the left-hand side are the evaluation dates. The next column to the right is the rate of cypermethrin per vial. The next column over to the right is the number of moths that are surviving versus the total. And the column that I'll look at mostly is percent mortality. And you look at this 2019 data from Minnesota, they did an excellent job of getting 0 mortality in the untreated check. That really helps us look at the data and feel comfortable with it. The 10 microgram vial had still pretty good control, 93% in the early trial, 100% later in the year. The 5 microgram in the early test was only about 62% effective. That did increase in the late trial to near 87%. Same year, 2019 at Arlington, I had a little bit of mortality in the untreated check, but the 10 microgram treatment performed very well, 100% mortality at both sampling dates, as did the 5 microgram treatment. Not quite 100%, but still pretty efficacious. 2020 results from Rosemont, only one sampling date. The moth flight dried up after the early August 21st sampling date, and they could only get enough moths to run one sampling date. There was some mortality of the adults, 25%. You can see that in the bottom row. The 5 microgram treatment only had 53% mortality, and the 10 microgram, 76%. And that's on top of the untreated check with 25% mortality. So we can see some performance issues at those rates at Minnesota in 2020. At Arlington, the early sampling date, we had really poor mortality, only 23% in the 5 microgram treatment. The 10 microgram treatment on both sampling dates was much better. And we had very little mortality in the untreated check, which is good. We find the data less confusing then. But I guess what I would like to point out with this slide is, although our percent mortality went from 23% in the early, in the early sampling date, it bumped up to 63% mortality in the second sampling date. So even though we had a difference of probably 3 to 4 weeks in there, there was a change in mortality. So if I could summarize, the mortality varied by concentration, which is what you hope for, which is what you expect. That's why you choose those levels of concentration. It also varied by location, certainly from year to year, as you might expect between 2019 and 2020, but also by the time of the year, early versus late. So perhaps that means that it depends on our source of moths, where they're coming from, and their exposure to the pyrethroids on the way up. So, but I do think that the data does suggest that there's still some ongoing, if not moderate levels of pyrethroid resistance. Now, the second part of the funded trials was the small plot insecticide trials for larval resistance monitoring. And again, we'll have data for 2019 and 2020. Our goal was to not only evaluate the in-season larval resistance, but also to assess alternatives to the pyrethroids. As we go on in the future, we want to look at other alternatives other than just pyrethroids. 2 locations, again, Rosemont and Arlington. And between the 2 trials, we had similar plot protocols as much as we could. There are small plot, 2 or 4 rows, similar insecticides, and also similar rates and gallon per acre as well. We try to standardize them as much as possible. For the treatments, the top 4, excluding the untreated check, but Warrior, Brigade, Coragen, Prevathon, as you can see in the left-hand column, were in all trials both years. Next column over, you can see the rate that we use, as well as the active ingredient. But if I can draw your attention to that right-hand column, looking at the different classes. Of course, Warrior, Brigade are pyrethroids, same IRAC code, and Coragen, Prevathon, although they're the same active ingredient, they're also in the same class code of 28. They are the diamides. For 2020, at both locations, we included Intrepid Edge, which is a mixture of methoxyfenozide and spinetroram, and they are 2 different IRAC class codes. Halogen was added to the Minnesota trial only in 2020. And that's a nuclear polyhedrosis virus that's specific for Helicobacter pyrethroid or corn earworm. Okay, let's look at the data. And first thing I probably should add is Murphy's Law of Entomology is alive and well. It's as consistent as the laws of physics are right now. And Murphy's Law of Entomology states that when you start field research with an insect, you can expect its populations as it did. In the 4 trials that we have run so far, we had low pressure in 3 of the 4 years. The 4th one was 2020 from Minnesota. We had pretty good, or Bill and Eric had pretty good pressure in that trial. And I'll save that to the end. So the first plot was Rosemont 2019. There was no significant difference in that column with mean number of larvae per ear and or percent control. I should go back. The treatments, left-hand column, the rates again, and then our parameters are mean number of larvae per ear and also total number of kernels. So backing up, no significant differences in mean number of larvae per ear. There were some differences, statistical differences between the insecticide treatments and the untreated check. Although the pressure was low, I think what we can take from that, even with low pressure, the best that we can take from that is the insecticide treatments were all statistically the same, but also there is no difference in control between the pyrethroids and the diamides. Arlington, same year, 2019, table is set up much the same. With mean number of larvae per ear, the data was kind of jumbled. The best that we can call from that is that Previthon did perform better in mean number of larvae per ears than the untreated check. And there was no statistical difference in total number of damaged kernels per ear. Again, low pressure. Arlington 2020, again, low pressure year. Not a lot that we can draw from the insecticide use under those circumstances, but what we can say is that all insecticides, both the diamides, the pyrethroids, and Intrepid Edge, perform better than the untreated check for both mean number of larvae per ear and total damage kernels per ear. And the other conclusion we can draw from that is, again, low pressure, but we could not separate any differences of the means with the insecticides. They're all performed adequately. Maybe not adequately, but at least they perform the same. Now, Rosemont, 2020, a high pressure year. And the table is set up the same again. If we go down to the bottom row, the untreated check, we had almost an average of 1 earworm per ear. And for the untreated check, an average of 16 kernels per ear with feeding damage on it. Okay, with high pressure, we could get some separation of means, and the coragen, or I should say the diamides, coragen and Previthon and Intrepid Edge had better control, statistically better control than the pyrethroids, and both the pyrethroids and the halogen, the nuclear polyhedrosis virus. In terms of total damage kernels per ear, we weren't able to get the separation means quite so easily, but what I can draw from that, a conclusion, is that all of the insecticide treatments performed better than the halogen. But again, all of those insecticide treatments, including halogen, performed better than the untreated check. So to summarize that, with a low pressure year, not a lot you can draw from that, but we did not see any significant differences between modes of action. In the one high pressure year from Rosemont in 2020, what we can say is all insecticide treatments were statistically better than the untreated check in terms of both larvae per ear and total number of damaged kernels per ear. In that second bullet point, Coragen, Prevathon, and Intrepid Edge were statistically better than the pyrethroid brigade, warrior, and also halogen. And the third bullet point, all insecticide treatments had statistically fewer damaged kernels per year than halogen. Okay, moving on to the unfunded part of the talk, but still I think pertinent to earworm control. Some concerns that we have is that the bioengineered sweet corn hybrids using Bt toxins, it is another mode of action for rootworm control, but earworms are also, another common name is a cotton bollworm. And the concern is, as a migratory pest, they're subject to widespread use of the Bt proteins in cotton as they migrate up. In cotton, they have gone through several Bt cryproteins, LEP proteins, and they are failing to control earworms on a consistent basis. The VIP3A protein, which is a different structure protein than the Bt cryprotein, that VIP3A still remains effective for the cotton producers, and that's a good thing. They need that. They don't have many tools in the toolbox. But if resistance does develop to that VIP3A, we're likely to see some increased foliar insecticide use, both pyrethroids maybe, certainly diamides, and that's going to have implications for Midwest sweet corn production in the future. And it's not just sweet corn, but I see I'm getting a little short of time. I'll jump through this pretty quick. But in field corn, earworms are a secondary pest at best. The VIP3A protein is still being engineered into a lot of the corn hybrids. This non-essential use of the Bt toxins, non-essential to me at least, will increase the exposure of earworms in that population, and that too, in that crop, can also affect control in the Midwest. Currently, EPA has a mandated monitoring program, but it's not designed to track susceptibility over time. It's more or less just to track resistance according to EPA's definition, and that's either a plus or minus situation. It is resistance or it is not. So just a couple more slides available. The Sweet Corn Sentinel Plot Network is a brainchild of Dr. Galen Dively, University of Maryland. And I kind of covered those next two bullet points. And with his Sentinel Plot Network, he's expanded it over time to now include 30 locations by 2020, 16 states, and 4 Canadian provinces. In the map, you can see where those locations are. The solid dots are where earworms are thought to overwinter. The open dots are where earworms probably do not overwinter. So 30 locations. The hybrids that we used, and we're not so concerned about which hybrids they are as they are the trait packages, which is in the middle column. And in the far right-hand column, I have what the specific above ground Bt proteins are. We looked at the attribute series, attribute 1 series, which has a single cry 1AB protein engineered into it. And then also the attribute 2 series, which is a pyramid that uses that same cry 1AB protein plus that VIP3A protein we're just talking about. Of the Seminus varieties, the Obsessions is a non-Bt as Providence was, and Obsessions 2 is in their performance series trait package. That is a pyramid. It's a cry 1A.105 and the cry 2AB2 proteins. Okay, data. Minnesota looked at their Syngenta hybrids over 5 different planting dates. In the interest of time, there was a little blip in the May 13 planting date. That's, for me, that's a little unusual to see that high of pressure that early. But if we look at the June 12th and 25th planting dates, we see an increase in pressure in June 12th Still, the single gene Cry1AB protein had some damage in it, but when we looked at the late planting date, there is no difference in terms of percent of ears infested with the Cry1 protein. However, that pyramid with the VIP3A protein added to it still performed very well in that late planting date. Wisconsin data, one planting date, a late planting date, I think that was right around June 25th. In the Providence non-BT, we had 20%, a little over 20% ears infested with earworms. The single gene Cry1AB protein in BC 0805 still had 10% infested ears. The remedy by itself, the remedy, which is a pyramid with the Cry1AB and the VIP3A protein, had no damage. And that's been pretty consistent across all locations in 2020. The Obsessions plot, which was about a mile north of the Syngenta plot, the Seminus hybrids, we had lower damage there, and still about 3% damage years with that pyramid. Okay, in conclusion, and with these concluding remarks, this reflects what Galen has been seeing over time. What I showed you in the previous two slides was a snapshot, what happened in 2020. So keep that in mind. Looking at that second bullet there, he has seen a trend in unexpected injury to the Cry1AB protein since 2004. And it seems to be increasing, maybe not every year, but over time, percent infested ears has been increasing. He also noted unexpected injury to the pyramid of the Cry1A.105 and Cry2AB2 trait packages starting in 2015. And finally, to date, the VIP3A protein has been performing well. There have been some earlier indications of maybe resistance, maybe that's too strong of a way to put it, maybe a lower level control. But for the most part, in 2020, the VIP3A has been performing quite well. With that, Jed, I'll turn it over to you and take any questions.
Thanks very much, Brian, for your presentation. We have one question entered in the chat box. If there are others, please enter those now. And that comes to us from Jennifer Thompson. Jennifer asks about the application timing for corn earworm insecticides in relation to flight.
Okay, good question. And there's not a black and white answer for that. Certainly from an IPM perspective, you would want to see a flight of earworm adults. And I'll qualify that by saying, pheromone traps are by far our best trapping method that we have. Although you need a pretty good network of those traps, a mile away, two traps can have completely different trap counts from low to high. So you have to keep that in mind. With timing of control, and this goes back, I think, to some work that Bill has done, and I think John Wedberg as well. We try to target our first application at early to mid silk. And I'm talking about just with the synthetic insecticides. So that first application followed up about 5 days later. Usually you can expect to see full 100% silk at that point in time. And then we are at weekly intervals after that second application. And typically with the phenology of sweet corn, we're looking up finishing that last application roughly a week before harvest. Other questions or comments, discussion?
Hey, Jed, Bill Hutchison here. I'll just chime in real quick, agree with everything Brian just said. Another way to say it is the timing of that first spray is most critical. And early to mid silk, another way to say that is about 20% to 40% silk is kind of the optimal window for that first spray. And that's anything you control in the first 2 sprays is most likely going to be the most critical at harvest in terms of keeping those 1-inch worms out of the ears.
Great, thank you, Bill and Brian. Checking my time here and not seeing any additional questions. Thank you both very much for the work and the presentation. It's greatly appreciated. And at this point, we'll transition to our second presentation. And Dean, you're welcome to share your slides at this point. Our second presenter